For over 60 years now, the Dalai Lama has been this global symbol of peace. But behind that image is an incredible story of a leader who was thrust into power at just 16 years old, forced to flee his own country, and then tasked with this monumental job, preserving an entire civilization while in exile. So today, we're going to trace that story, and we're going to do it by drawing directly from his own words, his own account of a lifelong struggle for Tibet.
Okay, let's just dive right in with this one sentence, because this is the sentence that marks the turning point. This wasn't just a journey, it was a complete rupture. Think about it. March 17th, 1959. A 23-year-old man who happens to be the spiritual and political leader of his people has to slip out of his palace in the middle of the night. This single event really sets the stage for everything that comes after it. A story of immense loss for sure, but also of incredible resilience and this unwavering search for a peaceful way forward.
So that flight into exile, that's our first act. And it's an incredibly dramatic escape, but it didn't just happen out of nowhere. To really get the desperation of that moment, we've got to rewind a little bit and look at the 9 years of rising pressure that led right up to it.
What's so fascinating here is how you can literally see the path from hope to desperation. It all starts with the invasion in 1950. That's followed by the 17-point agreement, which the Tibetan delegation was basically forced to accept. China's officials literally forged their seals. Then, the Dalai Lama actually travels to Beijing, he meets with Mao, and for a little while, he's genuinely hopeful about autonomy. But by 1959, the repression is just getting worse and worse, that hope is gone, and the people of Lhasa rise up to protect him. You have to imagine how terrifying this was. The decision to finally flee came just hours after 2 heavy mortar shells landed right outside the palace walls. Then, the state oracle, in a trance, delivered this incredibly stark 2-word message, "Go tonight." So the escape wasn't just about saving his own life, it was about preventing a massacre of the thousands of unarmed people who had surrounded the palace to protect him. So he arrives in India as a refugee, and he is facing this almost unimaginable challenge. This wasn't just about, okay, how do I survive? It was about ensuring the survival of an entire nation's culture, its religion, its identity, all of which was suddenly cut off from its homeland. So let's take a look at how this incredible task of rebuilding actually began.
The response was immediate, and it was really strategic. With crucial support from India, the focus was laser sharp. Rebuild the core pillars of Tibetan civilization. That meant schools, so a new generation could learn the Tibetan language. It meant reestablishing the great monastic centers of learning, and it meant creating a democratic framework to govern themselves. The goal really was to build a vibrant Tibet outside of Tibet.
And this number, 97%, this just shows you the sheer urgency of their work. While they were busy rebuilding everything abroad, this is what was happening back home. In a really courageous petition in 1962, the Panchen Lama, who had stayed in Tibet, reported to Chinese leaders that over 97% of the monasteries and temples had been destroyed. It was a clear, systematic attempt to erase Tibetan culture right at its source.
All right, so once the exiled community is kind of finding its footing, the focus naturally shifts. It shifts to finding a long-term political solution. And this is where we see the beginning of what the Dalai Lama describes as 2 intense periods of dialogue with Beijing. And each one was marked by this flicker of hope, a hope that was ultimately just extinguished by disappointment.
This statement right here from China's new leader in 1979. This was a seismic shift. After 2 decades of total silence, this was a huge overture. It kicked up the very first serious attempt at negotiation, and it created this genuine belief that maybe, just maybe, a solution that worked for both sides was finally possible. So the Dalai Lama took Deng at his word. He sent these delegations into Tibet to see the situation for themselves, and what they found was a population that, even after 20 years of occupation, was still fiercely loyal. The massive, emotional crowds that greeted them absolutely stunned the Chinese officials. But in the end, Beijing never offered any real, substantive proposals, and the talks just fizzled out. And here's the crucial point. Even when a second, much longer round of dialogue started up in the 2000s, the outcome was exactly the same. The Tibetan side presented a really detailed plan, a memorandum based on the principles of China's own constitution, and it was just flatly rejected. They called it a backdoor attempt at independence. And get this, after 9 rounds of talks, the Chinese side never once presented a counterproposal of their own, not once. So what was this proposal that Beijing rejected so forcefully? Well, it definitely wasn't a demand for independence. It was actually a really carefully crafted political philosophy, something developed over decades of thought, and it's known as the middle way approach.
To really get the Dalai Lama's position, you have to see it as this pragmatic path right between two poles. On one side, you have the deeply held dream of full independence, and on the other, you have the harsh reality of occupation and assimilation. The middle way was designed to be a realistic, non-confrontational alternative to both of those. At its heart, the approach is all about compromise. It's designed to address the biggest concerns on both sides. For the Tibetans, it secures control over the internal stuff that really defines their identity: culture, religion, language, and the environment. And for Beijing, it accepts that Tibet remains part of the People's Republic of China, which would keep control over defense and foreign policy. So, with dialogue basically at a dead end and, at an advanced age, the Dalai Lama's focus has had to shift again. And this time, it's about securing a future for the Tibetan people and their freedom struggle, with or without him.
This move is it's truly historic, and it might be one of his most profound legacies. He voluntarily dismantled a system of governance that had been in place for nearly 400 years. By completely separating the spiritual authority of the Dalai Lama from the political leadership of the Tibetan people, he made sure that the freedom movement would be led by a durable democratic institution, not just by a single person.
And this is why all of this matters so much right now. As the Dalai Lama writes, the very identity he's worked his entire life to preserve is under a systematic threat. Sources are reporting that up to 1 million Tibetan children have been separated from their families and put into these state-run boarding schools, a policy that seems clearly aimed at replacing their Tibetan identity with a Chinese one. And on that intensely debated question, the big one about his own reincarnation, his position is really clear, and it's totally consistent with his democratic reforms. He basically says the decision doesn't belong to him, and it certainly doesn't belong to the Chinese government. The choice of whether to even continue the institution of the Dalai Lama, he insists, rests solely with the Tibetan people themselves. Ultimately, the Dalai Lama's account of his life doesn't end with some neat conclusion. It leaves us with this powerful, unanswered question. After a lifetime spent championing nonviolence and dialogue, what happens when one side just refuses to talk? It's a question that really defines not only the future of Tibet, but the very nature of peaceful resistance in our world today.